In early 2025, anxieties surged along the Canada-US border, not from natural disasters, but from a political storm brewing in Washington, D.C. The familiar flow of people and goods was suddenly overshadowed by uncertainty as rumors of new trade barriers began to circulate. President Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs on Canadian and Mexican imports, including a 25% tariff on Canadian goods. The announcement sent shockwaves through both countries as industries and workers braced for the fallout. These were not idle threats. The impact was immediate, shaking Canadian industries and government. Stock markets tumbled and business leaders scrambled to assess the damage, while workers feared for their jobs and livelihoods. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau warned that such tariffs would hurt both nations, vowing Canada would respond. He called for unity, urging Canadians to stand together in the face of economic aggression. The White House's unpredictable stance made planning nearly impossible for Canadian businesses. Small business owners, already struggling with inflation and supply chain issues, now faced a new wave of uncertainty. On March 6th, Trump signed an executive order delaying tariffs for 1 month, a brief, uneasy pause. The delay offered little comfort, as most believed it was only a matter of time before the tariffs would take effect. Canadian leaders began preparing countermeasures, determined to defend national interests. Behind closed doors, officials debated strategies, weighing the risks of escalation against the need to protect Canadian jobs. The government drafted retaliatory tariffs targeting U.S. goods, aiming to pressure Washington to reconsider. These measures were carefully chosen to maximize impact while minimizing harm to Canadian consumers. Provincial leaders, especially in border regions, felt the urgency to act, knowing their economies were at risk. Local officials met with business owners, searching for ways to cushion the blow and keep communities afloat. The threats from the south were no longer abstract. They were a direct challenge to Canadian livelihoods. Families worried about rising prices, while farmers and factory workers faced the prospect of layoffs and shrinking markets. Memories of past trade disputes resurfaced, but this felt more severe, threatening decades of cooperation. The sense of partnership that had defined the border for generations was now in jeopardy. The nation braced for confrontation, watching as the economic relationship with the U.S. teetered on the edge. Across Canada, people anxiously followed the news, hoping for a breakthrough but preparing for the worst. Canada's resolve was clear. It would not be dictated to economically. The country's leaders and citizens alike stood firm, ready to defend their interests and values. The stage was set for an unprecedented response as Canada prepared to face one of its greatest economic challenges in a generation. British Columbia Premier David Eby responded swiftly to U.S. tariffs, determined not to let British Columbia be caught off guard by American trade aggression. On March 6, 2025, Eby announced plans to toll commercial trucks traveling through BC to Alaska, a direct hit at the Alaska Highway, the vital artery connecting Alaska to the rest of the United States through Canadian territory. The move was framed as a necessary defense against Trump's erratic tariff threats, which had left Canadian exporters and officials scrambling for answers. The Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act, introduced March 14th, gave BC the authority to impose tolls if U.S. tariffs escalated. The legislation was crafted quickly, reflecting the urgency of the moment and the need for a flexible response. The act was temporary, set to expire in 2027, signaling hope for a resolution but also a warning that Canada would not wait forever for fair treatment. The tolls could extend to private vehicles and ferries, not just commercial trucks. Everyday travelers, tourists, and even Alaskan families could soon feel the impact, making the stakes personal for thousands. The Alaska Highway, a symbol of North American cooperation since World War II, now became a pressure point in the dispute, its future uncertain. BC leaders argued they couldn't absorb the economic damage without a meaningful response. Local businesses, already struggling with cross-border uncertainty, braced for more disruption. The announcement sent a clear message. Canada would use every tool available, refusing to be a passive target in a trade war. The move resonated beyond BC, showing provinces were ready to act independently, but in coordination, united in their resolve to protect Canadian interests. Targeting the Alaska supply route exposed a U.S. vulnerability, highlighting just how dependent Alaska is on the Canadian corridor for essential goods and services. Details were still in development, but the intent was unmistakable. Canada was prepared to escalate if provoked, and the world was watching. The Alaska Highway, once a symbol of unity and shared sacrifice, was now at the center of a trade standoff, its legacy hanging in the balance. The bill was expected to advance quickly, keeping pressure on Washington and signaling that Canada's patience had limits. Canada's countermeasures were no longer theoretical, they were becoming reality, with infrastructure changes already underway. The border's new battleground was a road, and the world was about to see just how high the stakes could climb when trade and geography collide. News of BCE's proposed tolls sent shockwaves through Alaska. The Alaska Highway is a lifeline for time-sensitive goods, especially fresh produce and critical equipment. New tolls threaten food security and raised costs for Alaskans. Alaska's oil and gas industry also relies on fast, reliable trucking. State Senator Robert Myers and trucking leaders warned of major disruptions and higher prices. Alaska's unique geography means few alternatives. Any new barrier hits hard. Businesses recalculated budgets, fearing for their survival. The trade dispute was no longer distant. It threatened daily life in Alaska. BC's toll plan was just one part of Canada's broader response. Prime Minister Trudeau announced federal tariffs targeting U.S. goods, aiming to minimize harm to Canadians. Ontario joined in, imposing a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the U.S., a direct hit to American consumers. BC expanded its actions, halting purchases of U.S. products and banning liquor from Republican-led states. Provinces coordinated with Ottawa, showing national unity. Trudeau's government also pushed to remove internal trade barriers, strengthening Canada's resilience. The message to Washington was clear: Canada would not be passive. Countermeasures targeted multiple sectors, creating pressure points across the U.S.-Canadian federalism, allowed provinces to act regionally while supporting a national strategy. By mid-March, Canada's economic defense was mobilized. Yukon quickly joined the Canadian response. Premier Ranch Pillai halted government liquor purchases from U.S. companies and restricted American access to Yukon contracts. Pillai emphasized these actions were about defending Canadian sovereignty, not targeting Alaskans. Canada will never be the 51st American state, he declared. Yukon suggested further measures, from banning Alaskan athletes at the Arctic Winter Games to barring Donald Trump Jr. from hunting in the territory. Yukon considered joining BC in tolling the Alaska Highway, but logistical hurdles loomed. The territory's response blended symbolic actions with practical caution. Yukon's voice, though small, was firm in asserting Canadian identity. Alaska's leaders responded with concern. Governor Mike Dunleavy urged BC to reconsider tolls and called for federal negotiations. Business leaders warned that tolls would raise costs and disrupt supply chains, hurting Alaskans. Senator Robert Myers highlighted Alaska's dependence on the highway for fresh food and oil industry supplies. The Alaska House passed a resolution affirming Canadian sovereignty but condemning trade restrictions, seeking a return to cooperation. The message: Alaska valued its ties with Canada but feared economic fallout. The dispute was now personal for Alaskans. Trade tensions soon threatened cruise ship tourism, a vital industry for both Alaska and BC. Every year, millions of visitors travel through these ports, supporting thousands of jobs and injecting billions into local economies. The stakes were high and the uncertainty rippled through communities dependent on tourism. U.S. law requires foreign-flagged cruise ships to stop in a foreign port, usually in BC, en route to Alaska. This long-standing rule has made British Columbia a crucial stopover, turning its ports into bustling gateways for North American cruise travel. In retaliation, Alaska Senator Dan Sullivan threatened to seek a waiver of this law, allowing ships to bypass BC entirely. This bold move was meant to pressure Canada, but it also risked upending established travel routes and business relationships. Such a move would devastate BC's tourism sector, which relies on cruise passengers. Local businesses, from hotels to restaurants and souvenir shops, depend on the steady flow of visitors brought in by the cruise industry. The threat was real. A similar waiver happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. When cruise ships stopped coming, the impact was immediate and severe, leaving terminals empty and businesses struggling to survive. BC's coastal communities feared job losses and business closures. For many small towns, cruise tourism is the economic lifeblood, and any disruption can have lasting consequences for families and workers. The cruise industry became a bargaining chip in the dispute, with both governments using it to gain leverage in broader negotiations. Both sides held leverage, Canada with land routes, the US with maritime law. The complex web of regulations and economic interests made compromise difficult but also necessary. The standoff now included vital service industries, raising the stakes. Thousands of workers in hospitality, transportation, and retail watched anxiously, hoping for a resolution. The urgency for a diplomatic solution grew as both nations recognized that the livelihoods of countless people and the future of cross-border tourism hung in the balance. BC's toll plan raised tough questions. No toll stations exist on the Alaska Highway. Building them would require major investment and new staff. Yukon faced similar logistical and legal hurdles. International agreements from WTO could complicate tolling, risking legal challenges. Some argued existing way stations could be adapted for tolls, easing implementation. Deciding toll rates and managing revenue would be complex. Environmental and community consultations would be needed. Turning legislation into operational toll booths was a daunting task. The trade dispute put both nations at risk. Canada faced potential economic harm and strained US relations. Alaska risked higher costs and supply disruptions. The cruise industry's fate hung in the balance. Despite tough talk, both sides recognized the need for a solution. BC's temporary toll law and Alaska's call for negotiations signaled hope for diplomacy. The dispute highlighted deep economic interdependence. Leaders now face the challenge of de-escalating tensions and restoring stability. The hope highways would remain channels of commerce, not conflict.